Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining EMU's the MENA Mix Regional Recap. I'm Hala Bugaighis. I'm a Libyan researcher and expert. My work focuses on peace building, development, and social reforms. And I'm joined today by my co-host, Dr. David Wood. David is a senior researcher at the Center on Conflict Development and Peace Building at the Geneva Graduate Institute. He has over 20 years of experience in mediation, conflict sensitivity, and the humanitarian development peace nexus. He has founded and co-founded impressive initiatives throughout the years, and he has over 50 publications on these topics. Welcome, David. I'm so looking forward to our discussion today.
Thanks, Hannah. No, I'm really looking forward to it. We've got a lot to talk about, and it's good to talk with you again after quite a while.
Thank you. So, David, October has been an eventful month across the Middle East. So, from Gaza, fragile ceasefire, to Sudan, horrific, humanitarian crisis, the renewed tensions in Syria, and the growing competition over along the Red Sea. So, we have a lot to unpack today. But let's start with Gaza, if you don't mind. After nearly 2 years of the devastating war, I think a ceasefire has finally taken hold in Gaza. So I think the deal that has been brokered with strong involvement of the U.S. alongside Egypt and Qatar is managed to pose the fighting to a certain limit, and also to allow the aid to flow for now. But I'm really wondering, I mean, with your expertise, how do you see the situation in Gaza?
Hannah, you're right. I think you started by saying October has been an eventful month across the Middle East. It seems like we could say that every month, that there's always a new dynamic that we had to get our head around. And I think just in terms of your introduction, what I'd like to just emphasize is if it isn't already clear, I think it should be clear to anyone who works in the Middle East that there is no such thing as a contained conflict or a contained issue, that all of the issues that we talk about interact with each other. So, whether it is in Yemen, Syria, or Lebanon, those individual cases or crises interact with the wider region. So, we've always got to have those two parts in hand. How do we deal with this individual crisis? And how do we deal with its impact on the region and vice versa? So coming back to Gaza, the first point that we'll talk about, I think it's important to say from the outset, I'm not an expert on Israel-Palestinian conflict or on the dynamics in Gaza. I suppose the way that I look at it is through a very important example of how mediation is being done in the region. The US-led, more transactional approach that looks to deal with the immediate manifestations of a conflict rather than what's underlying them. But then also how the process of that mediation impacts on the wider region and on stability in the wider region and what's happening in the wider region. So, from my perspective, I mean, what we have seen with the Trump administration's push on Gaza is the achievement of something which many of us felt was impossible. This national ceasefire, this stopping, not stopping, but this reduction in the suffering of the people of Gaza, the Palestinian people,
Yes.
which is an important step. Now, that is, however, very transactional, I feel. It's focused on this issue of prisoner and hostage exchange, and then the cessation against the cessation of hostilities from Israel. But it doesn't address the substantive issues, those being what happens with the Palestinian state? How do we ensure humanitarian needs? And how do we provide Israel with a sense of its own future and security in the wider region? I know that's a lot already, so I don't know if you have any responses before I kind of continue to unpack those.
No, I think let's start first with the humanitarian issue, and then we go with with the Palestinian state. And I think it's very important because I hear a lot from Palestinian experts. Maybe we start there, that
Sure.
they are concerned about the 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 arrangement, if you may, because it's focusing on Gaza but excluding the rest of Palestine, and it's like it is not very inclusive from the very beginning. So I really wonder, I want to pick your brain on that. How do you see it? Is it correct? Is it like, how can we ensure that the whole Palestinian, state is involved in this? And I'm also not an expert in Palestine, so we're just two here wondering about things.
Yeah, two outsiders trying to
Yeah,
understand what's happening.
absolutely.
So if you think from the mediation practice, part of this is actually quite good, but
Yeah.
there are negative consequences. So in mediation theory, you have something that's called chunking. So the
Mm,
idea is that each individual issue is harder to deal with if they're put together. So when you chunk issues together.
mm-hmm.
So if you put together a narrow agreement on Gaza with wider issues of the Palestinian people and state, with other issues, it becomes harder. So what you might try to do is de-chunk them, push them apart, and try and deal with them one by one. However, you've got to have a plan for that, a process, kind of a roadmap for how you get from that first step to the next.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I see that's lacking. So yes, this is focus on Gaza,
Yes.
but it is to the exclusion of the other issues that Palestinian people face in the rest of Palestine. And there isn't a linkage to that. And the kind of the second weakness that I see is that this kind of, I keep saying transactional approach, is trying to get a transaction on one of these issues between the conflict parties, has been driven from the outside. So this transactional approaches are often forced on the conflict parties, right? You need to do this. And there's been evident pressure on
Mm,
on both Hamas and on Israel. Now the challenge is that you can see backtracking when that pressure is reduced,
mm,
external pressure is reduced, and part of perhaps what we're seeing with this ongoing humanitarian issue is one of, do we have significant and substantive enough pressure on the outside to make sure there's an adherence not just to that narrow agreement but to the wider implications, whether that's the kind of humanitarian issues facing people living in Gaza, or the status of those in the rest of Palestine, their ability to work, to travel, their ID cards, and so on. So
yes.
I think that chunking is good, but it's an issue if we don't link it to the other problems. And then you have this kind of question around, okay, is there enough external pressure if we're taking this transactional approach?
Yeah, that brings me to another thing that I've been discussing. I'm in New York for the Women, Peace and Security Week, and there's a lot. Of course, Gaza is in so many discussions, and many were like concerned that the U.S. transactional approach, as you mentioned, is risking really freezing the conflict rather than resolving it. And I don't know how. I mean, in your what should be done? I mean, you mentioned the roadmap. Do you think this is something that the U.S. and also Qatar and Egypt are maybe considering? Do you think it's something? Mm,
Um, yeah, so again, I think what we've kind of learned is interesting. So you're in New York at the One Peace and Security
yeah.
discussions. I was just in the European Union in Brussels at this conversation between different mediators around the new world of mediation
Mm,
and the impact of this new US driven transactional approach was coming up again and again. So how do we deal with it? And I think there was kind of a very nuanced approach, which is we need to recognize that there are opportunities there, but we need to step in and provide guidance on how to take those opportunities, because a
mm,
ceasefire by itself is not enough. So we almost need to create that process and hand it over to advise on that process. And perhaps
mm,
that's where we on the peacemaking mediation side are a little bit behind the curve. So I think it is possible to engage with the US, Qatar, and Egypt on what a longer term process looks like. We've also had kind of noises that the UN efforts could also step in at this point. So that's the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, which has not had a role at the moment. So can that mechanism come in to provide a process that's lacking at the moment? So I think from the outside, if you're in the mediation community, we can suggest and recommend processes, and then we can work with both multilaterals like the UN and
yeah.
those direct partners to recommend them. And I don't think we're doing that enough, perhaps, at the moment.
Yeah, this is I think very, very important. And it's brought me to something you mentioned when you were talking about Gaza. what is it now for Palestine state? How do you
Mm.
what's next
Yeah.
in your opinion?
Yeah. So again, without that expertise of the
I
past
know.
negotiations in the Palestinian state, what I see from the outside is
Yeah.
that it's very clear that with that transactional approach focused on this narrow ceasefire, on the exchanges of kind of prisoners and hostages, that the question of the Palestinian state was purposely put aside. So if you look at the Trump plan, it doesn't mention the Palestinian state at all. And there might be ready reasons for that in terms of having the Israelis buy into it. But what it does is it means that you push aside one of the key causes of anger and resentment of the Palestinian people, but not just the Palestinian people, the wider Middle East and the Arab and Muslim world. This is an important question for us. How can we get to a Palestinian place? So I think it's right to be surprised by and to support this ceasefire because the Palestinians were suffering so much, because of the killings, the humanitarian causes, and
Mm.
so on. However, my kind of key message is that unless we also have that process in place to start a conversation very quickly with the Israelis about recognition of a Palestinian state, we will, in the near or medium future, wake up to another October the 7th, because that resentment and anger will be bubbling away and it
Mm.
will need to express itself in some way or another.
So who do you think can take the lead to push for this? To push for this in the agenda, because I don't think that this is in the agenda in the current mediation. I mean, do you see, like, I don't know, EU, for instance, you mentioned EU, or any, I think UN are already in a critical position at the
Mm.
moment. So I don't
Yeah.
see them doing much.
Well, I think for me it is the kind of the regional countries. So this is the
Mm.
Saudis, the UAEs, Qatar, that have influence and
Yes,
relationships with the US, and for whom this is important. You know, this is an important
I
issue for them. If
agree.
you go to
Mm.
regional gatherings, they raise this question and again and again. So I think
Yes.
it's a collective effort of engaging with the kind of the US to make sure that there's pressure on the Israelis for this to be on the table. And they're not shy of that. So if you look at the Saudi position on its participation in the Abraham Accords and
Mm.
normalization with Israel, they've made it very clear that they want some kind of progress made on the Palestinian question. But let's not forget, this is a new ceasefire, although it
Yes.
feels like it's been there for a long time. And so we might be a little bit behind the curve in terms of working with our colleagues within
Yes.
Riyadh and other places to push this agenda, but now is very much the time.
So I think you mentioned Abraham Accords and, the Israeli position. I mean, where now where Israel is now in the region? How do you see the normalization efforts and all of the position of Israel in this in the region?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. And
Yeah.
I feel like you're asking me a lot of these Gordian knot questions, the things
Yes.
that are so hard to unpack and resolve. And I think I'd predicate this
Yeah.
by saying do not have myself an involvement within
Yes.
the Israel-Palestine conflict and the Gaza war. So what I bring is very much from the outside, and I want, as someone on the outside, a future in which there is both a Palestinian state that is stable,
Mm.
that is functions for the people of Palestine, and redress for the injustices that the Palestinians have faced. And I also want an Israel that is stable, that views itself to be secure within the region and has good relationships. So, from a mediation lens, you want both those
Yeah.
seemingly incompatible things to exist at the same time. Um, in the region, if I from the outside look at kind of the longer term kind of Israeli strategy or perspective,
Mm.
I think there are kind of two issues that happen at the same time. One is how do we defeat Hamas and provide, in the Israeli perspective,
Yes.
security on our
Mm.
doorstep? But then also, how do we ensure that the future of Israel inside the region is secure?
Mm.
And there is this threat which goes back to the previous wars of, this fear of an external attack, of the role that the other states in the region will play. Now, one way of looking at the previous Abraham Accord was it
Yes,
tried to shift the logic and the process a little bit.
exactly.
Before that, there was very much this kind of logic that there is no chance for Israel to achieve stability in the region and relationships with others unless Palestine is solved.
Yeah,
The Abraham Accords reverse that logic towards, well, if the step towards resolving the Palestinian issue and achieving a Palestinian state is better relationships with the regional actors, the regional countries. And I think my kind of key message is there is no sequencing here. Both have to happen at the same time. They're so interlinked. The
yeah,
issue of the Palestinian state with Israel's regional security is kind of really interlinked. And for the at this kind of the struggle of, sorry, just
yes,
to talk for a little bit more because this is a point of kind of passion, I think for me. I think what the Israelis have underestimated is the level of trauma that has rippled from Gaza through the region.
absolutely.
So
You're
I had
right.
this, yeah. So I heard this fantastic phrase earlier this week in a conversation on transitional justice of vicarious trauma.
Mm,
You're co-suffering with others. Now, if you look across the Arab and Muslim world, there is a suffering that people have, co-suffering with the people of Gaza. But
yes,
broader than that, if you look at, I'm Irish and British. If you look at my countries or the European Union, there is a Muslim population here that is also co-suffering, but also non-Muslims who feel very passionate and co-suffering with the people of Palestine. So that trauma will endure, and it's especially amongst younger people, and it'll be generational. And that kind of trauma is the kind of trauma that leads to hatred and to a willingness to use violence in the future. So again, Israel might wake up to another October the 7th if it doesn't deal with the Palestinian state internally, but it's also more likely to suffer from external threats from within the region because there'll be pressure on the leaders of capitals in the region from these traumatized people
yes,
to do
absolutely.
something about Israel. So I don't think the Israel has really calculated on this 10-year, 20-year, 50-year
Yes.
perspective on what it means, this trauma that bubbles away. And so we also need to deal with that trauma of people across the region. Sorry, that was quite a bit of a long-winded
No, no, I think,
uh, intervention.
no, that's very important, and I know it's the trauma is real. So I'm seeing it, in Libya and in other places where I'm visiting. So the last thing that I want to ask on this topic, and I know that this is another topic close to your heart. So
Yeah.
do you think that there is a role for commemoration here? And I'm reading the book. I'm reading your book, The Ethics of Commemoration. So it's with me here, but I really want to know if there is a role for it here.
That I know that there is a role, and it's having a negative role at the moment, and we
Mm,
need to shift that. Um, so just a kind of 2 seconds on commemoration.
yeah.
What I'm meaning by that when I say that I often say we need ethical political commemoration. We need a way of marking past abuses and injustices which doesn't maintain hatred. So often
Mm,
when you do commemoration, it's done in a way that then builds hatred towards the group that created the atrocity.
yes.
Um, but we need to leave that cycle. We need to, through commemoration, imagine a joint future. I think that this was best said in terms of the Gaza context by actually the Saudi ambassador to the UK, Khaled bin Bandar Al Saud, who in a
Mm,
meeting just, is it the last year? No, it was last year, who said, I want to imagine a future in which Israel plays football in the Middle East rather than in Europe. How do you get there? That's a big statement.
yeah.
So
Wow.
what I'm seeing negative at the moment is that you've got a commemoration war that's quite live,
Mm,
in which the Israeli side is through social media and events highlighting the the suffering of the victims of October the 7th terrorist attack. Then on the other side, you have a lot being done globally to highlight the suffering of the people of Gaza, quite correctly, including,
mm,
for example, a commemoration in Holland, which was just children's shoes to mark
mm,
all the children in Gaza who'd been killed. Now, unless you're careful with that, that builds hatred and resentment towards the other side. And in the region, commemoration that builds hatred is actually a political tool. It's a way that you can
yeah.
maintain your base and support. And so there's a risk that political leaders across the region commemorate the suffering in Gaza in a way that maintains this hatred towards Israel. And we've got to work on that
Yeah,
very hard, I think. And
I,
the other,
I, yeah,
yeah, sorry.
you can finish your thought. I don't want to
But
dictate.
also the other way around. I mean, there's a risk, and we see it live, that the way that commemoration happens around the victims of October the 7th is is creating an acceptance inside Israel towards mass abuse towards the Palestinians. So you need to work on both sides, I think.
I think so, and I think I mean, I really hope that the ceasefire will hold, and maybe a better mediation or a more informed mediation will take place in Gaza. They deserve uh, the peace. So now turning to another a very heartbreaking situation that's happening in the region, which is Sudan and the situation in El Fasher, which in my opinion has reached a breaking point with the siege of the city by the RSF. And I think it's very important to talk about this and to highlight that it's a catastrophe because there's so many factors. First, I mean the humanitarian issues. It's awful to see that the the mass killing, the supply lines cut. I mean, health facilities destroyed, mass displacement, the weaponization of food supplies, the weaponization of women bodies. So it is a catastrophe by all means. In addition, there is an ethnic violence and there is an ethnic motivated killing and detentions. So it's another, war crimes and another, alerting issues. Let alone that, and last and not least, I think there is a risk of a de facto split of Sudan, and this is something that, will have not only the impact on Sudan itself, but also in the whole region. And, I told you that I'm here in New York and, from
Mhm.
all the talks, and there were so many strong statements by Sudanese women that for me, it seems like the international mediation is paralyzed. They don't do anything. And I don't know, what do you think? Why there is no effective mediation in Sudan?
Yeah. Again, another difficult question for us to grapple with. But I think it's important to say that when we were preparing for this podcast, you and I had a range of news items, and we were both focused on Sudan. We said we need to grapple with Sudan because it's often overshadowed by Gaza. At any other time in global history, the Sudanese conflict would have been the focus of international news. It would have been the focus of mediation efforts and the focus or attempts to globally to try and reduce harm. And I think we haven't done enough to raise the Sudan as this global priority. I was just talking yesterday with one of my close friends who works in our space, an Arab, who said, I feel complicit in the suffering of the Sudanese people because I have not been raising it in my work. And we're so focused on Gaza correctly that we've left one of the big crises in the globe underaddressed. We're talking about 100 to 200,000 people having died, over 9 million displaced, over 4 million refugees. So this is something we need to kind of really focus more on. So why hasn't mediation efforts work? I think what you've had in Gaza, by contrast around the ceasefire, is a very clear leadership from Egypt, Qatar, the US, with the willingness to put pressure on the conflict parties to enter into a very transactional, limited negotiation, but still one. We lack that I think, in the Sudanese context. We have too many efforts in parallel, which are all backed by different regional actors to promote their own interest. I mean, we have the Quad for Sudan, the Quartet of Special Envoys, IGAD's initiative led by the Kenyan president, the Cairo initiative, the Turkish initiative, the UN-AU consultative group. These overlap, and it allows you as a conflict party to mediation shop. Okay, who do I go to now? Who's going to give me the best outcome? But from the other side, I mean, what we're also seeing from the conflict parties, and I'm going to be very superficial and say by that I mean the Rapid Support Force, the RSF, and the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF. They have proved very resistant to mediation. They do not seem to prioritize it, and the language, the narrative that comes out from both sides is this can only be solved through guns. But I think for me, the key issue here is again about that international leverage and pressure. And the problem, I think, in Sudan, which I think we'll get to, is that certainly regional actors have their proxies inside the war. And so certainly, if you look at the UAE and its support for the RSF, for example,
Mm.
it's not doing enough to pressure the RSF to come to the negotiation table. In fact, it seems to be doing the opposite, providing a blank envelope support.
So, do you still there is a room for other mediator instead of like countries like, for instance, the African Union? Do you think that there is a room for regional? I mean, at least for humanitarian access, you know. Um, I mean, do you see this happening, or it will be continue like this? Because I think it's why they're doing this, because it's already, it's like they have the impunity. They've done it before. It's not new, and they feel that they can you know, they can do it again and again. So, do you think there's others who can be involved in this?
From a process design, a mediation process design perspective, we don't want others to be involved if you have all these initiatives that I listed ongoing. What we really need
Mhm.
is for an agreement around who is the leading process, who is
Mm.
it that's leading, and that does need some accommodation between the different interests backing each one of these initiatives.
Mm.
So I think we need first some kind of forum where those who are looking to provide a mediation role actually agree who it is, what leverage they have, and what support they're going to have for that. But then coming back to the kind of point of leverage, I think it's so important is that if we look at the humanitarian crisis in El Fasher, what you've seen is over this period of time in October and before that, you know, a pattern, I think, of reckless and ruthless actions by Arab states as they project power through their local proxies. And this happens in various places. So what we have, I think, in this context is specifically is that the UAE has a relationship and support for the RSF, which means that yes, we hold the RSF accountable for these atrocities, and we need some kind of accountability framework.
Mm.
But we also need to hold UAE responsible. I mean, you could argue that the UAE is actually a state funding war crimes at the moment. And that's why, because of that involvement through proxies on the ground,
Mm.
we're not seeing enough joined up effort within the mediation world as well. So I think if we're going to get those regional actors and others to have a joint approach to Sudan, we also need to be much clearer with them on the repercussions for them enabling human rights abuses. That there will be some kind of accountability also for them, not just for those conflict parties on the ground actually undertaking these atrocities.
Do you think that I know that we alluded to it, that there is a regional impact for what's happening in Sudan, especially when it comes to
Absolutely.
displacement and all of this. So, in your opinion, what's the regional impact, and can it be leveraged in you know, ensuring that, you know, Sudan situation will be prioritized in the agenda of the different, you know, regional and international actors?
Yeah, I think this takes us to kind of one of those points in the introduction where I think I said that we need to like recognize that each one of these crises are interacting with a kind of a regional
Mm.
dimension, regional issue. I can make it very local if that's okay, and come back to a place which we both
Yes.
know and you're from, so from Libya and the kind of the interaction there in Libya. Um, so I think kind of generally we need to think about that regional interaction and impact as not just one of dealing with flows of refugees with the economic consequences, but in how the parties in one conflict provide support and succor to the parties in another conflict. So, what we've seen in Libya, for example, over a long period of time, is the RSF, the Justice and Equality Movement, the Sudan Liberation Movement, the Sudan Liberation Movement Army. There are two different branches of them, kind of all have a role within Libya to some
Mm.
degree. Mostly that's been in the south, in alliance with the the Libyan National Army and with General Haftar's forces, but also with the Wagner Brigade and also with its reformed um, African Corps entity. But also we saw, for example, that some of these forces were involved in the attack on Tripoli in 2019. So there is this direct relationship between the group's involvement in different countries. Even in 2023, there were strong reports of the LNA providing kind of logistical support training to the RSF.
Mm.
I'm not sure if that has continued beyond that, but certainly that was a kind of a pivotal moment. Then if we look even hyper locally in say in the kind of the Kufra area of Libya,
Yes.
southeast, you've seen an influx of refugees. Now, in my conversations with Sway leaders in that area, they're
Yes.
concerned about what this influx means for them. As you know, there's already a kind of a slight ethnic demographic clash between Tebu and Sway, but they're
Yeah.
both concerned now that the clashes in Sudan are going to be replicated on Libyan soil because these refugees involve people who are both supporting, in their perception, the RSF and the Sudanese kind of armed forces. So there's a fear that there's going to be a kind of a repercussion here. So I think when we talk, one of the reasons I don't like the word proxy so much is it seems to say there's always an external superior partner that is supporting a local partner, and that relationship is vertical. But actually, it interacts, it goes both ways.
Mm.
So you have these relationships between Sudanese forces, those in Libya. Also, we've had Egypt supporting parties on the other side, on the government side. You have UAE supporting a side, and they rely on each other. So for UAE, it's a way of projecting their influence and promoting their interests.
Yes.
And for CRSF, it's a way of getting their support. So I know that's not the solution you were looking for, but it's just kind of to point that we also need to kind of plan for these mediation work to be kind of looking at that regional interaction and to try and de-chunk. So how can we get the Sudanese forces to be less involved in Libya, which has happened over time? How do we get Libya to be less involved within Sudan? How do we get UAE to be less involved within Sudan? That's the kind of de-chunking I think we need to aim for.
But who can lead this? And this is the last thing that we will mention in Sudan. Who can lead this? Who have the political will or the will who can to lead such? It's I don't see it's an easy process what you're describing. But who can? Do you think it's a regional again actor or international?
Well, I think the point I made earlier is endures. It's the same one that there needs to be a negotiation between the different mediation efforts to
Mm.
agree on a joint approach. There's too much happening at the moment. There's too many things going on. So we
Yes.
need a very clear mediation process agreed by all the regional actors with leverage behind it. And I think what I was pointing to earlier, that also then involves a little bit of advocacy work to the regional actors and public shaming and naming to say that you need to
I
also
like.
not be enabling these atrocities. So the two go hand in hand.
Yes, I like that. So let's move to another area of expertise of yours, David, which is Syria. I think it was interesting to see that after just 1 month from the agreement to integrate the Syrian Democratic Forces
Yeah,
units into the national military, and new clashes just broke out this month
yeah,
in Aleppo between the government forces and the SDF. I think this is, for me, I was like, this is a sign that the state is still fragmented, and
mm,
that the conflict is not far from over. Actually, the conflict is far from over in Syria.
mm.
And since you are, I know that you've worked a lot in Syria. So what do you think these clashes tell us about the balance of power within the country at the moment?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good question again. I'm enjoying this conversation. I think that I'd go further than you. I would go to say that all the evidence that has been gathered around transitions over the last 40 years, including some great work, for example, done at OECD, points to the fact that in Syria, It's not a question of when the government will fall and we'll see return to large-scale civil war, of if the government falls and we return to large-scale civil war, but when, if the present trajectory continues. And I wouldn't describe it so much as a question of balance of power, but how the government is imagining it negotiates relationships with the different components of Syrian society in order to achieve a stable government and a stable Syria. And I think they're getting it wrong. So, I mean, just to come back to the entry point for this, I mean, the kind of the case study, as it were, around the clashes in Aleppo. So, what we have seen in Aleppo are that there has been checkpoints established by government forces around two areas, Sheikh Massoud and Al Sharafia. These are two Kurdish, newish Kurdish neighborhoods. And then the Kurdish community in those neighborhoods protested, went to the checkpoint. There was clashes, and that escalated into quite serious weaponry being used and kind of death on both sides.
Yeah.
But it's not just there. We also saw in Raqqa, for example, a key road from Raqqa to the rest of Syria being closed by the government through the installation of checkpoints. And again, community attempts to then breach those checkpoints. Although there we didn't see the violence because those who tried to breach the checkpoints were more from Arab backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, what I'm seeing is that the government, when negotiations with different parts of kind of the Syrian community, the constituency groups, aren't going its way, it uses force to try and leverage those groups to give it what it wants. So, for example, there has been this. You were saying this has been the stalling of this agreement around integration of SDF and the handover of some of the key facilities that they control, including border points and oil and gas reserves, for example. Now that hasn't gone the way it was supposed to, and so the immediate response from the authorities is, okay, let's put pressure on. Let's put pressure on by closing these checkpoints. But I see this as part of a wider pattern, and what I mean by that is that if we look at what happened in July to the Druze in Sweden, or we look at the Alawites earlier, there is this consistent pattern of the government directly using forces or proxy forces in order to gain compliance to what it wants. And I feel that this is kind of there's this narrative on the government side that we've freed you from Assad, we've liberated the country, and hence you should join us and support us without conditions. Without another approach would be, yes, we were pivotal in freeing you from Assad, but we understand you have concerns and trust issues with us, and we're here to talk with you about them, to dialogue with you, and to find a path to resolve them. Yeah, and if we're just talking about transactional mediation again, bringing it back to kind of Gaza, it kind of clear that Damascus agreement with the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, was leveraged in a transactional manner by the US. They put pressure on for this to happen. Is the backtracking because that pressure's not on at the moment because there's pressure needed elsewhere? This is one of the problems with transactional approaches, that it needs constant pressure to implement kind of the agreements that are reached.
It's interesting that you're mentioning. I've been in a discussion here, and the representative of Syria in the UN was talking that they want to dialogue and they want to talk to people and they want to address all the grievances. I mean, he was very diplomatic, and it was very impressive. And I really wish for the good of the Syrian people that this is all the promises would be fulfilled. But how can really, if we were able to advise the government, how can they do better beside the dialogue? And how can they really navigate this very difficult times?
Yeah. I'd love that you keep on bringing me back round to trying to think through solutions rather than let me wander around analysis, which is the right approach.
Yes.
But I think the point that you raise around that quite impressive statement by the Syrian representative of the UN, reflects a real disconnect in how the new government, de facto government, transitional government, whatever you want to call it, in Syria, treats its external relations versus its internal relations. Externally, we've seen that it is really willing to say the right things, to engage with everyone, and to try and achieve external stability for Syria through dialogue, meeting with the US,
Mm.
meeting with the EU, meeting with Israel, meeting with Russia. Now, you could have argued, you could have assumed that the government would have taken a quite strong line with Russia, given the fact that HTS was on the receiving end of
Mm.
Russian airstrikes and pressure.
Mm.
But it was a very pragmatic approach of no, we're going to go and engage with them to try and find, through dialogue, an approach that's going to work for us.
Mm.
Great. I support that. Internally, we haven't seen that as much. We've seen this pressure play, this coercive approach that only plays a very limited lip service to actual dialogue. And I think two examples that stand out for this are the approach to national dialogue and to transitional justice. Yeah. So national dialogue can't be done in 2 days in a conference in Damascus in February.
No.
So that was very limited. It was kind of an approach to say, we've done it, we've dialogued with you, it's over. But again, it didn't deal with a range of substantive fears that people have about the future. One way I always think about conflict is and why I think commemoration is so important, it's a co-imagining of the future based upon past experiences.
Mm.
If you are one of those communities in the northwest of Syria that suffered at the hands of HTS, that is your experience that informs your expectations of the future.
Mm.
So, in order to build a future, you need to remedy those injustices and create better expectations, hope for the future. But if we look at, for example, how the government approached transitional justice, it narrowed the scope of transitional justice to looking at really just the abuses of the Assad regime and excluding the abuses conducted by others, especially HTS.
Mm.
So if you're in one of those communities in the north, you say, our young men were kidnapped, were killed by HTS. Our women suffered at the hand of HTS. And we're not getting any justice for this. So they are now the enemy more than the Assad regime was. So that's the reality that the the government needs to deal with. How? I actually think they're pragmatic. I think there might actually be a vision gap, a lack of understanding that you need to build that kind of trust. And I think there is a process, again, externally, we can go through of providing advisory support because they are relying on us, the government, for technical support, for financial support, for other support. So I think there are entry points here.
Well, I really hope so, and I really hope that the situation in Syria will increase. I was here in also New York when after 2 months of deliberation, when I was listening to the Syrian activists talking very hopeful that we've done it and Assad is gone and I was like coming from the future, because I was like, we had the same experience, and if you don't address these grievances, if you don't have a serious talk with with each other, with all the components, this is from a Libyan experience. This will not lead you. This will lead you nowhere. But enough on Syria. Let's.
Just to jump in on that, because I think just one anecdote or one linkage. I remember I was based in Libya during that period in 2012, going to all the different conferences about building the future. And then there was this a very strong narrative from the new government that Libya's one, Libya's united, that there are no disagreements. And I think internationally, we bought into that. We believed it. Said, yeah, everyone's on board. Not everyone was on board or on board for the same reasons. And I think, however, in Syria, to give the international community credit, I think there's a greater understanding that actually not everyone is on board. That Syria is not united about the future. So in some of the conversations I have with diplomats, there is this understanding of we need to make a separation between supporting good governance in Syria and supporting the HTS-dominated government. So we
Yes.
need to do more work on the former and less on the latter, perhaps.
I think this is a good note to move to the final topic that we want to discuss today, which is the Red Sea, the tension in the Red Sea.
Mm,
I think it's very interesting. If you look at the Red Sea, I mean, there is the war in Sudan on its western shore, and there is the instability in Yemen in the eastern side. Of course, the Iran influence through its Houthis allies. I mean, this narrow sea um, now mirrors the regional shifting power map,
mm,
if I may say that. So I wonder, how would you describe the Red Sea, emerging landscape?
mm. Well, apart from the fact that it's a beautiful place that deserves to have many
I
people visit
agree.
it because it is so beautiful.
Yes.
Um, I think this links us back round to all the previous stories, especially the first story around kind of Gaza, how each individual conflict in the region has regional repercussions and then has a influence on the potential for regional instability. So I think of the Red Sea as an epicenter of how this regionalization of conflicts has occurred and how we can't just deal with an issue in one country without also dealing with regional security issues as well. I mean, I can expand on that in terms of the Yemen experience if you want, or
Yes, please. Yes, I would.
yeah.
I think it's very important to talk about Yemen, talk about the Red Sea.
Yes. So, I mean, what we saw, I think, with the Israeli offensive in Gaza and the abuses that were conducted, that we saw Ansar Allah or the Houthis
Yeah.
um, then respond to that by attacks, yes, on Israel, these missiles, some of which landed in Jordan, but also a targeting of shipping in the Red Sea. Now, this based upon the premise that there will be no maritime security in the Red Sea until we see a cessation of violence in Gaza and an improvement for the situation of the Palestinians. Now, the driving force of that action was twofold. It was ideological. Ansar Allah, the Houthis, absolutely believe in the Gaza cause, in the Palestinian cause, and absolutely believe that Israel needs to be defeated. That's a genuine belief, and they've been very consistent in their messaging over a long period of time on this,
Mm.
that they would take action. But the other side, there was an awareness of how their stance on Gaza will leverage support internally in the Yemen conflict. So what we've seen as these attacks have occurred in the Red Sea is that they've gained a lot of the Ansar Allah, the Houthis have gained a lot of support domestically because of the Palestinian cause. Externally, it's put the Houthis on the map. I have Yemeni colleagues who say, "Oh, I arrive in Germany," and everyone says, "Yeah, go on Yemen," conflating the Houthis with wider Yemen. It's also placed them in a more senior position in the axis of resistance, so-called, especially given um, the present state of Hezbollah, the defeat of Assad, and so on. More significantly for me, it's derailed the Yemen peace process, as now any progress made in trying to find a peace process in Yemen is predicated on the Houthis giving security guarantees in the Red Sea. So we can't make progress in Yemen now unless there's progress in Gaza, which leads to then securitization or a better of navigation within in the Red Sea. And it also means that the international community is now taking a more security approach to its involvement in Yemen. We've seen investments in the capacities of government-aligned forces, especially Tariq Salah's on the
Yeah.
west coast, to combat smuggling through the Iran Houthi network, but also to ensure maritime security. So now it means that you've had this chunking together of Gaza, the Red Sea, and Yemen, and all the resolution of all of those are now dependent on each other.
So I want to ask you about Iran. What Iran is doing? I mean, it's doing in the Red Sea.
Yeah.
I want to say that I really am not familiar with the Iranian, political involvement in the region.
Yeah. I was hoping you wouldn't ask, because neither am I. I,
Okay.
I think so. What we have seen kind of in October is reporting that there's a new strategy by Iran, or it's increased its infrastructure for smuggling and for trade and so on inside the Red Sea, for example, through its relationships with in Sudan, by establishing a foothold in at the Sudan ports. These are all things that have been reported. From my perspective, I don't see this as a new strategy, but a continuation of a long-term effort to project influence and support its partners in the region. It just so happens that Ansar Allah, the Houthis, are really the only partner left standing, and hence there's been an increased effort to make sure that they're providing the weaponry and other items to Yemen that are required. So I don't think it's a new strategy or a shift. I think it represents a long-term goal, which has
Mhm.
become more real by a weakening of other elements of the axis of resistance. I think, though, one thing where I'm going to say something which is a bit contentious in European diplomatic circles, there's a real feeling that kind of some of these efforts to kind of deal with maritime security through the UN and the US and the EU kind of operations there have reduced smuggling into Yemen and have combated the effectiveness and ability of the Houthis to target maritime shipping. I don't think this is the case. I think that a reduction in Ansar Allah Houthi attacks on maritime shipping is because of Gaza and the ceasefire, and they follow through on their word in a way. And also, they were actually seeing an increase in Iran network smuggling into Yemen to the Houthis. So I don't think that security-based approach has actually worked in the way that many people in European capitals think it has.
So what do you think is the alternative? It's like economic development, for instance. What's the alternative if it's not security based?
Yeah. Again, I wish I had the answer, but I think there does need to be a shift. And since you mentioned economics, I think it'd be wrong of us not to kind of raise the fact that the approach to maritime security in the Red Sea has been driven largely by European US interests, more so than by the interests of the littoral states, the states around the Red Sea, who are deeply affected, especially Egypt and Jordan. I'll just pull out the case of Egypt. If we look at their reduction in the income that they receive um, from public revenues because of the use of the Suez Canal, it's around, people are quoting a figure around $7 billion. That then increases to about $9 billion if you think about the reduction in economic activities. So some figures around that. However, Egypt has the biggest navy in the Middle East and North Africa, yet it has not been part of the maritime security effort
Mhm.
because it has to balance its economic needs with the public sentiment and support of Gaza. If it went on through a process of participating in these initiatives and targeting Ansar Allah, it would have been seen to be going against the Gaza cause. So it can't do that. Now, this might have repercussions seriously for Egypt because they need that $9 billion, 100%. So are we going to see an economic deterioration that leads to public protests, people on the streets, and instability in Egypt? That could happen. We know what's happened before.
Yes.
So the economic dimension is so important. And I think the securitized approach through EU and US operations misses a key factor that ultimately the Red Sea is made up of coastal communities that need to be able to survive, and their livelihoods are incredibly low. They engage in smuggling and piracy and so on, also because they don't have opportunities. So it's not just we need a security compact. I think we need an economic compact also for the Red Sea region.
I think this is a very good note to conclude our discussion today. It was very insightful. So I think we discussed, we started from Gaza, the fragile calm there, then the
Mm.
Sudanese humanitarian collapse, Syria, an easy transition, and the competition over the Red Sea. I think this month, October, has shown that how interconnected every fault line in the Middle East remains, right? And that the
Yeah.
conflicts may differ, but they all echo one another. And I don't know if you have any final reflections or thoughts before we conclude, David.
Yeah. I want to give for us to be hopeful. I mean, there has been a ceasefire. You have, as we didn't talk about it, but in Syria, you have had parliamentary elections with a lot of real questions, but you have.
Yes.
Um, there is reason for hope. And I also see is amongst regional actors, the diplomats that I talk to within in different countries, they really want to enhance the situation in the region. So I think we have willing partners if we work with them better and we provide better arguments and we provide solutions, the very kind of thing you're trying to draw from me, not the problems, but the solutions. I think we have partners who are willing to work with us. So there should be some hope.
I'm so happy that we're ending on a positive note, and I always say that we should remain hopeaholic, especially when dealing
I
with,
love it. Love it.
yes, when dealing with these issues. And so, thank you, David. Thank you so much. This was insightful. I've learned a lot from you as usual. So thank you so much, and thank you for everyone for listening to us. And we hope to see you soon at the end of November for our next episode of the MENA Mix. Thank you so much. And until then, salam. Thank you.
Thank you very much.